Hello everyone, welcome back to another segment of Finding Joy in Your Kitchen. Today I am going to be sharing with you a great recipe for apple dumplings. It's not very common, but it's definitely something that is delicious and a small enough recipe that you can share with your family, not have a lot of leftovers. So let's talk about an apple dumpling for just a short minute. An apple dumpling is like a personalized pie. So it's pie crust around a whole apple that's been cored, and then once you wrap the pie crust around it, you're going to pour sauce over the top of it. So the sauce is what we're going to do first, because we're going to let that cool for just a little bit while we're making the rest of our ingredients. So what I have in the pot today is 1 cup of water, 1 cup of white sugar, and I have 1/8 of a teaspoon of cinnamon and 1/8 of a teaspoon of nutmeg. So we're going to turn on the heat and get these to mix all together. And we want the sugar to dissolve. And I have the heat on a medium high right now. And what you're doing is you're allowing this to come to a boil. That's all you want it to do. You don't need it to boil for any certain time. Once it boils, we will take it off of the heat and add 2 tablespoons of butter. So those are the ingredients you're going to want to write down to get ready for your saucepan. So while I'm waiting for this to dissolve, I'm going to repeat those to you. A cup of sugar, a cup of water, 1/8 teaspoon of cinnamon, and 1/8 teaspoon of nutmeg, and then 2 tablespoons of butter. Other items that you want to get out and get ready that we're going to be using later on are brown sugar, butter, I said butter, flour, baking powder, salt, shortening, milk, and then you're going to want 6 apples. They don't need to be large apples. If you only have large apples, then you're not going to use as many. Maybe instead of 6, you would use 4. Otherwise, you would have to make more pie dough to cover the apples. So we're just going to continue to allow this to dissolve and work it up to a boil before we start working on the pie crust. The liquid is just about to reach the boiling point. You just want the whole thing to start boiling before you turn off the heat. And stirring it constantly helps, because then you know that the sugar's not going to burn. And then once this is all boiling, we will just shut off the heat, take it off the heat, and add the butter. Now we're going to make the pie crust that's covering the apples. And you're going to start with 2 cups of flour and adding your dry ingredients first. So this is 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 1 teaspoon of salt, and you're going to want to just mix that just together a little bit before you add the wet ingredients. And next, we're going to add a 2/3 cup of shortening. Sorry. And you're going to combine this with the flour, and you can use a pastry blender if you have one. If you don't, you can just use a fork. It'll do the same thing. And you just want to mix it until you have a pea-sized consistency of the flour and the shortening together. And just work it in best as you can. Once we have this mixed, we'll add the milk and form the dough into a ball. So pretty similar to your regular pie crust, except for this has milk in it. And I normally use water. and not baking powder. So it's going to give you a different consistency around the dumpling, but it's going to hold its shape at the same time. You know, I started making this, I'm honestly not sure when, but I stopped making it. And when I was trying to come up with some other recipes to show you, my mom suggested this one. And you just don't hear of it all the time. So it's a nice little change to what you're normally having for dessert with your family. And maybe you have some leftover, you have some apples that are sitting in your fruit bowl and you don't think they're going anywhere. You know, I think that my family goes in spurts where they're eating apples and bananas and any type of fruit, and then suddenly they just stop. So sometimes I have to use them up, and you know, like bananas, if I see that they're going bad, I just put them in a Ziploc bag and put them in the freezer so I can make something later. I really don't like to waste the food that I've purchased. All right, so now we're going to add the milk. And when you're measuring out liquids, make sure that you're using the right type of measuring utensil. You shouldn't be measuring wet ingredients with dry ingredient cups. For instance, this is used just for dry ingredients, and this will be used for wet ingredients. If you're using this for wet, it's going to put more liquid into your recipe and possibly ruin the outcome of the recipe. So this dough can get pretty wet. So once we put it out onto the counter, make sure that you have your surface well floured, otherwise it will stick. And along with prepping, you do not have to grease the dish that you're going to be using, but you're going to want to use a baking dish of some sort, like a casserole dish. So now we're going to form this into a ball. And I've got some wet parts in this. So it's just easier if you use your hands and gather all the dry parts that are still in the bowl. Sometimes people like to do it right on the counter, but I tend to do it in the bowl. That way I get every little bit. All right. This will make a good size piece of pie crust and be enough to cover 6 apples. And the apples that I have are medium to small. All right. Trying to get some of that pie crust off my hands. It even sticks to my hands, not just the counter. All right, so I am liberally flouring. And just making sure I have it mostly where I'm going to be rolling out the dough. Having my rolling pin ready and somewhat floured. I'm going to have to flour it again, probably a few times. And we're just going to take the dough out, roll it onto the flour a couple times, make sure it's nicely coated. And you're going to want to roll it into a 9 by 12 maybe? I don't know, we'll measure it when I get done rolling it. But you're going to want it to be in a rectangle. And once we get it that way, we're going to cut it into the 6 squares. And that will shape around, see, already. I'm talking and not paying attention. Anyways, that will shape around the apples that we're going to peel. And it's okay that that ripped. It'll go right back together. Very wet dough. And see what I'm doing? I'm just using the flour that I have on the surface just to help me so I don't keep having that issue. If you're not familiar with working with dough, it's good to see the tips. I know I'm probably about 9 by 13 right now, but I'm going to go a little thinner. The last time I made these, I think the dough was slightly too thick. They still tasted good, but they just didn't turn out the way that I like. So I measured the dough and it's roughly 12 by 16. And we are going to cut it into 6 pieces. I use a pizza cutter just because it makes the smoothest cut. And it's not too sharp to put right on the countertop. And once I cut these, then I'm going to peel the apples and then core them. And I'm actually going to cut them in half. It allows for the apple to cook through evenly. And I'm just going to do a bunch of prep work for a little while. All right, so now that we have the apples prepared, they're sliced and cored, and I'll show you what those look like in a second. But before you go on to the next step, you want to have this bowl ready of a 1/4 cup of brown sugar firmly packed and a 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon. And just have them combined. It doesn't have to be perfect. And depending on the size of your apples, you may not use all of it, but you're going to want to have it ready. And also pads of butter. If you don't know what a pad of butter is, it's not the size of a tablespoon. It's just a small amount, like that. Probably, I don't know, how big do you think that would be? Like
half a teaspoon.
Half a teaspoon, like the size of a dime, I would say. And you're going to, we're going to need that in part of this process. So have those ready. I would say that was roughly a tablespoon and a half that I cut up for the pads of butter. Okay, so now that we have that ready, have it on hand. So the apples, I peeled them and cut them in half. Keep your halves together because you're going to want to make them into one. Actually, I have that one upside down. And once you have them, you're just going to cut out the core. And you're going to set it in the middle of your dough. And take your sugar mixture, put it down into the inside. And if you wanted, let's say you didn't have brown sugar enough, you could use white sugar. I've used both. I just think that the brown sugar gives it a richer taste, so I just prefer that. You could also add some nuts to this if you wanted, pecans or walnuts, whatever your liking is. And once you get the sugar in there, you're going to put the pad of butter right on top. That one jumped out. And then you're going to take the corners of the dough and wrap it up around. Now your dough has been sitting here, so it should still be pliable. And you're gonna seal the dough together. Keep folding it up. And it's almost like you're gonna hug the dough around the apple, okay? And just keep squeezing it around the apple. You're gonna do this process with each one. And then once you have it ready, you're just going to put it into the baking dish. All right, so let's continue. So this is what they look like. As you can see, I had maybe some extra pieces. We just put them over the top of the dumplings, and that just helps seal up any cracks you might have in the top. And it doesn't have to be perfect. The apples are still gonna cook through. And now comes the good part. You're just gonna take that sauce we made earlier and pour it over each dumpling individually. And we didn't really discuss what type of apple to use. There are specific apples for baking, and you can look those up. I'm using Macintosh, and that's not your typical dessert apple. It doesn't always hold its form. You could use, I've used Fuji, I've used Cortland, I've used Granny Smith. You could use 20 ounce. It's really whatever you prefer, and it's just whatever you have on hand. Might come down to it another time. So it might seem like a lot of sauce, but this sauce is gonna turn into almost like a caramel at the bottom. Okay, we are going to put these in the oven at 375 degrees for 35 minutes. Once that's done, cover them for an additional 10 minutes. That just keeps them from burning. All right, so I just took that out of the oven and it's still boiling, but it smells delicious. And you probably could tell one of my dumplings collapsed. It's still gonna taste the same. And not quite sure why that happened. Maybe I didn't have a seal very good, but it's still gonna turn out just fine. So another way you could check if you feel that the dumplings aren't quite ready, usually they do split apart just a little on top. You could always sneak a fork down inside, and if your fork releases smoothly from the apple, then more than likely they're done. But you do want them to have a nice brown coloring on the top. I hope that you've enjoyed this segment on apple dumplings, and maybe it's something that you can put into your recipe book and keep for the years to come. Have a great day, and God bless. Welcome back to my kitchen. I am happy that you stopped by and decided to take a peek at another one of my segments.
Honey.
I think I just have to get the giggles out.
Yeah, well, it's recording your giggles.
Oh, great.
Are you gonna do it?
You're gonna have to stop it. All right, the dumplings are going to go